everyone. Welcome to Preemie Chats. Preemie Chats is a program that is for healthcare professionals and for families to talk about what matters to you, to explore new ideas, and to learn together. I'm Leah Whitehead. I'm the proud mom of a preemie and former journalist, and I'm happy to be your host today from Halifax, Nova Scotia. Preemie Chats was created and is put on by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation, also well known as CPBF. That foundation is a parent-led charitable organization that helps families in and after NICU through education, support, and advocacy. If you have a heart for preemies, whether you're a healthcare professional or family, I'd invite you to head over to our website there on the screen, canadianpreemies.org. And there you will find many free resources that you can use in your NICU or just to help learn about prematurity. You'll hear about all the latest projects that CPBF has going on. And most importantly, you'll find a community of people who want to see our little ones thrive. Today's session is live, so I'd invite you to please bring your voice to the table. It's always interesting to see where people are joining us from. And also bring your questions, bring your comments, bring your experience, because it is through the rich conversations like what we're about to have where we can advance practice and learn from each other. So please participate. Let us know where you're watching from today. As you probably know, November is a big month for CPBF and actually for preemie parents everywhere, all over the world, because it is the month of World Prematurity Day that happened on November 17th. The theme for this year was access to quality care everywhere, with a focus on maternal health and prenatal access. Today, we are continuing that conversation as we look at a holistic view of maternal and early life health. We're going to explore the smallest of factors, nutrients and microbes, and the voices of experts by experience. These are essential ingredients for the prevention of adverse pregnancy outcomes, the care of preterm babies, and for supporting healthy life trajectories. To lead us in the discussion, we're going to be joined by early life nutrition expert, Dr. Kristin Connor. Dr. Connor is an associate professor of developmental origins of health and disease in the Department of Health Sciences at Carleton University, where she runs a transdisciplinary and translational research program. She is passionate about improving and supporting maternal, fetal, and child health. She has a long list of projects she's involved in, including being a member of the advisory board for the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Institute of Human Development, Child and Youth Health, serves on the Council for the Society for Reproductive Investigation, is an associate editor for the Journal of Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, and is co-founder of the Alliance Against Iron Deficiency in Benin. Welcome, Kristin. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to have a discussion with everybody.
I will put your presentation up and allow you to get right to it.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Well, as a translational researcher, I'm really excited to be here to talk about a few key elements that I think are critical for the health and care of babies, including preemies. And of course, as everybody in this audience knows, the 2024 theme of World Prematurity Day was access to quality care everywhere. And today I kind of want to take this a little bit further to talk about two requirements that I think are essential for quality care everywhere and for everyone. And that includes a better understanding of why babies are born too soon, why they grow poorly, and why they have other conditions. And also a better understanding of the experiences of families and bringing these two things together. They're both pieces of evidence, the science and the lived experience. If we can bring these together in terms of our health and our research and care, I think we'll be doing a really good job to help support everyone everywhere. So unfortunately, we know that globally, there actually hasn't been much of a measurable change in the rates of preterm birth in the last decade. And this is in part despite the fact that we have increased investments in many countries around the world So it suggests to me there's some missed opportunities. And these missed opportunities might be related to having a poor understanding of the biological pathways that drive suboptimal growth and development and adverse pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth, having a poor understanding of the different contexts and populations that are affected by prematurity, and also not thinking about and integrating the lived and living experience. So I think we need to take a more holistic view of maternal child health and well-being, and that includes the science and the experience. Because if we can understand both the science and the experience, and particularly understand that they are both critical for maternal fetal health, for preventing preterm birth, for improving prenatal care and neonatal care, and for advocating for babies so that they have the best starts to life and are supported throughout their life cycle, I think we'll be making bigger advances in these fields. And to make these gains in quality care for everyone, I think we really need to understand, and probably most of us here understand this, but perhaps others don't, that health trajectories start very early, long before we're born. This means we need to be aware of the environments that are across our life course, which includes the preconception period. And this applies not only to mothers, but also to fathers and adolescents, boys and girls, long before they're contemplating a pregnancy. We also need to think about the period very early in pregnancy, even though it's a time when the nutritional requirements of the fetus and the embryo are quite small. We know it's a window that is incredibly important for maintaining maternal health, critical for embryo and placental development and function, and setting the later trajectory for that individual. And of course, the fourth trimester, the postpartum period, is a really important time for early feeding practices, behaviors, further acquisition of nutrients, for parental care and bonding. And this window also potentially offers us the opportunity to correct paths that have been set prenatally or perhaps even periconceptionally, and allows us to act in a way that could maintain an optimal course in terms of health and development. And this idea that health trajectories are established early comes from a concept called developmental programming, or the developmental origins of health and disease, which is essentially defined as a stimulus or an insult that operates at a critical or sensitive period of development that could then result in long-term effects on the structure or function of that individual. And the stimuli that are involved are many, but they roughly fall under exposures related to infection and inflammation, xenobiotics, stress, and of course, nutrition. And these exposures then interact with our genes and our epigenome, and we're learning more now, our microbiome, to elicit the phenotypes that we eventually see. And I think it's important to point out that whilst these are biological factors that I'm talking about here, they certainly are influenced and brought about by social, structural, and environmental contexts. So what do we know about the early life environments and how people see these as being important for longer term health? Well, the first data that I wanted to show you are data that are from studies that have brought together experts by experience and asked them, what do you think is important to learn about and fund in relation to the care of preterm babies? And the first study that I want to show you here on the left is a study from a geographically diverse group of knowledge users, where when they answered this question, they came together and decided that research on family participation in care, exclusive breastfeeding, probiotics, especially their safety and efficacy, and kangaroo mother care were key areas of research, key priorities for preterms. The second study that I want to point out is a study that was based in California, and it brought together people with lived and living experience and those organizations that cared for them, particularly women of color who are at high risk of preterm birth. And in this group, when they were asked similar questions, they deemed that maternal stress and stressful interactions with healthcare providers was a key priority research area, as was more research on health systems and health inequities and problems related to prematurity, as well as infant nutrition. Other studies have also asked similar questions, and here's a study that was conducted in high-income countries that aimed to identify research priorities and core data that should be collected from studies related to neonatal care. So not just for preterm babies, but all neonates. And of course, beyond immediate survival, which is obviously the top priority for all knowledge users and groups, you can see here that necrotizing enterocolitis and brain development and function are top outcomes identified that should be captured in all neonatal research as deemed by this group. And these opinions align with emerging research in these areas and the priorities that I just spoke about on the previous slide, including that we know that optimizing nutrition and growth are strategies to help mitigate poor neurodevelopmental outcomes in preterm babies. And yet there have been very few randomized trials that have actually looked at preterm nutrition and relationships with neurodevelopment. Similarly, we know that there are studies being conducted to understand probiotic efficacy and safety in preterms, and we might talk about a couple of those in a minute. Other core outcomes these knowledge users identified as being important were those related to parental involvement. And of course, we know parental involvement in hospitalized neonates improves their care. But what does the science say? Well, indeed, the science does say that early life and across the life cycle, nutrition is one of the most influential factors in shaping health trajectories. So this aligns with some of the priority areas that these other groups have identified. But what do we know about early diets and preterm birth and poor growth? First, I need to say that understanding which components of a diet might associate with adverse developmental trajectories or preterm birth is notoriously hard to figure out because it's difficult to capture accurate dietary data in humans and diets vary widely. So we do have to be careful about the quality of evidence. But a recent systematic review has examined the effects of diets at key windows in the mother, and they've tried to relate these diets to the risk for preterm birth, low birth weight, and small for gestational age. And what they found first was that there's actually not a lot of data that can give us a clear picture of the types of diets pre-conception that may associate with risk for preterm birth. But of the limited data available, it looks like diets that are high in protein and fruit, but low in fat and sugar, and those takeaway meals are more likely to be associated with lower risk of preterm birth. Now, during pregnancy, we have a lot more data. The data are more robust. And these data suggest that diets that are of higher quality, particularly ones that associate with the DASH diet, so dietary approaches to stop hypertension, traditional and prudent diets, and diets high in vegetables, fruits, and rice, as well as specific components like high fruit and veg intake, high whole grains, and possibly fish and dairy, especially if probiotics are involved, are also associated with lower risk of preterm birth. Similar dietary patterns are seen with low risk of small for gestational age, particularly high fruit and veg, legumes, seafood, and dairy. But there's not much data, and the data seem to be mixed in terms of what a good pregnancy diet might look like and risk for low birth weight. So remember I said that despite the increased investments that many countries have put in place to reduce rates of preterm birth, we still haven't had many changes in these rates globally, and therefore they're probably missed opportunities. And these opportunities may include needing a better understanding of some of the novel underlying mechanisms related to poor growth and preterm birth. And in the context of nutrition, in fact, reports suggest that even if we take all the current knowledge we have and apply it to improve the nutrition of pregnant people and their babies, outcomes like poor growth and development may only be ameliorated by about 30%. And I also talked about that early period of pregnancy where the placenta is important. We know that placental function and vascular flows are very critical to regulate growth and development of the fetus, and also are important for risk of spontaneous preterm birth. But it's not easy to see how we can actually correct the placenta and vascular flows in utero to optimize development. So I think this is where we need to start thinking about new or underexplored mechanisms that might be driving growth and development outcomes, as well as risk for preterm birth. And one of these emerging mechanisms involves microbes, both those that live in and on our bodies, as well as those we might be exposed to through our diets. And we need to first understand that microbes, particularly those that reside in our gut, provide and metabolize nutrients for us. So they're a really, really important part of our nutrient health. The microbes themselves and the metabolites they produce can regulate many systems in our physiology. And this includes the immune system and inflammatory processes, which might be particularly important in the context of preterm birth. We also know from a variety of studies that understanding more about the microbiome might be important for two aspects of health and disease. First, these data could potentially help us as a diagnostic to identify diseases earlier, detect them earlier than we do now. And also, microbes in the microbiomes might be targets for intervention so that we can prevent or reduce the burden of some of these diseases. So what do we know about the microbiome in preterm birth? Well, a few studies have shown us that the maternal vaginal microbiome is different in mothers who deliver preterm compared to mothers who deliver at term. And here's just one study that I wanted to show, predominantly in a population of African ancestry, which is important because these groups have higher risk of preterm birth than those of European ancestry. So again, these data are especially important to collect if we aim to better understand outcomes like preterm birth and support the care for equity deserving and racialized groups. And this study was really great because it surveyed a huge number of people, and it found that in the vaginal microbiome, reduced levels of a specific type of microbe, Lactobacillus crispatus species, and higher levels of other species, including Prevotella, BVA-B1, TM7H1, and others, were associated with preterm birth. So because we have data like this, we can now ask, can we use these microbes and their levels as a biomarker for preterm birth? And potentially we can combine this with other clinical data to assess preterm birth risk earlier than we do now. And investigators around the world are actually starting to work on this. And if you recall the data I showed you identifying core outcome sets for neonatal research and those priority research areas from experts by experience in preterm birth and low birth weight, NEC was identified as a high priority for researchers, healthcare workers, and families. And the science is also starting to tell us that microbes might be important here too. We know from prior studies that the preterm gut microbiome, its composition and its function, are associated with the onset of NEC. And some studies have shown that receiving maternal milk, so the infant receiving maternal milk, can provide protection against NEC. So the question then is, why might this be? Well, the breast milk obviously contains multitudes of things, including microbes, including nutrients, immune factors, and many other bioactives. And so researchers are now starting to ask, is the protection that's provided by the breast milk for NEC conferred through these breast milk microbiomes? And some very recent studies that have just come out are ones that I want to talk about in the context of this right now. And this first study actually asked that question, and the answer to it was no. There's so far no association between the maternal milk microbes and the risk for developing NEC. But that doesn't mean there aren't other things in the breast milk that may confer protection against NEC. And so the protection that we do see is just likely not occurring through these milk microbes. And as a scientist, I like to think about this from a translational perspective. And maybe in the context of milk, we can think about donor milk. And this study, what it might be suggesting is that restoring the microbiome in donor milk may not be the strategy that will help reduce NEC. But again, there are other components in the breast milk that might be very important drivers. So what are some other drivers, or what are some other strategies that might actually help in terms of necrotizing enterocolitis? Well, probiotics may be an option, as we know. And again, better understanding of the safety and efficacy of probiotics in preterm babies has been highlighted as a research priority in those studies that I talked about at the start. And so emerging studies that have come out very recently have shown us that certain strains of probiotics are the main driver of the composition and function of the microbiome in preterms who receive these probiotics. And these are in preterms that don't have any intestinal disease. And a very recent study came out that I'm showing here that demonstrated that probiotics impact the gut microbiome similarly in extremely preterm and extremely low birth weight babies as they do in very preterm and very low birth weight babies. So what does this mean? Well, it shows us that the probiotics are affecting the preterm gut microbiome in the same way, irrespective of how early that baby is born. And that's actually very reassuring because we don't have differential impacts that might be of concern if we want to administer probiotics. So this continues to suggest that probiotic administration is likely beneficial in these babies, and particularly these extremely preterm babies that are at highest risk for NEC. So it's clear the science and experience are coming together in our health community and saying the same thing. And yet we know that patient experiences are often excluded and ignored, and sometimes even viewed as complaints. We know that experiences are not considered scientific evidence, and that marginalized populations are most affected, including in prenatal and postnatal care. So the status quo is just not acceptable. And this is where many of us believe something called libraries of experience might actually help. And these libraries are collections of stories and lived experience evidence that go beyond just using and collecting healthcare and scientific data or information to really bridge that gap between what we know from the science to have health and well-being. So what is a library of lived or living experience? Well, it's a collection of stories, as I said, perspectives and insights from experts by experience. And these are situated to inspire dialogue between healthcare professionals as well as individuals with lived experience for better shared decision-making. But they're also sources of insight that can help inform future research, care, and policies, particularly ones that are designed with and acceptable to the communities in which these are meant to serve. And they can also be resources for advocacy groups. So I wanted to just touch on a couple of libraries that are starting to be developed here in Canada. And these are related to preconception, prenatal, neonatal, and child health and care. And one of the first steps is actually involving gathering these stories of lived experience so we can bring this disparate information together and make it accessible to those who need it for decision making and advocacy purposes. And one of the efforts we're involved in is first trying to ask what is occurring in Canada and globally in terms of gathering the evidence by experience in the preconception through to the first 1,000 days of life. And how then can these data or experiences be used, and are they even being used to inform research, care, and advocacy in the real world? So hopefully we'll have a paper out in the next 6 to 9 months about that, and so you can watch the space and go to our website. But from these data, we also hope to identify challenges and opportunities to equitably inform care, health literacy, and policy for diverse populations. Another library that's being developed, and it's a little bit further along, and that might be very much of interest to this group, is a collaborative visual learning tool to advance care and advocacy for neurodevelopmental conditions. And this is a library where activities are led and supported by families or caregivers with lived or living experience. And this library, the website link is at the bottom of the screen there, as I said, is in development phase, but you can go to the website to see what the library will be about, and hopefully it will launch in the next couple of months. And it's a library of lived experience, as I said, related to neurodevelopmental conditions, and it's hosted out of University of British Columbia, my colleague, Dr. Dan Goldowitz, and others. And so this library is going to be really great because it uses a resource called Tapestry, which is this very interactive tool where one can go to the site and click on these different nodes to explore information about patient and family stories, academic resources, peer-reviewed scientific information related to these various themes, and learn more about neurodevelopmental conditions. And I think these libraries are actually going to be exceptionally important to extend the efforts that the scientific community is doing now, where many people simply just engage with patients and families to get their opinions on outcomes, as opposed to actually integrating this into evidence and decision making. And I think they will help address a statement that Dr. Fraser Mustard said a number of years ago when he was still alive, which was the challenge for all societies is to close the gap between what we know about the determinants of health and what we do. So I hope I've convinced you, if you didn't convince yourself already, through your own experiences and knowledge, that investing in early life means investing in the entire life of an individual. And that's because health trajectories start early. And to do this, we need to know more about developmental processes and the factors that contribute to these, including outcomes like preterm birth. And I think this includes better understanding of some of the most influential factors in those first 1,000 days, which we know includes nutrition and emerging data suggests may also include microbes. And I think we also really need to try to reframe our position in what we're doing as researchers, clinicians, people with lived experience in a very positive light, because oftentimes we think about these situations as adverse triggers, adverse exposures, adverse outcomes. But we need to think about exposures that support and establish resiliency too. And that includes interventions and the timing of these, because they can also support and establish resiliency. And of course, real world experience shapes the best care. And I do think that evidence from these libraries of lived and living experience and continued community engagement will help to get us there. So I look forward to hearing some of your questions, and thank you so much for listening to our talk today.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I was scrawling notes as you were talking. There was so much information. And I think, a lot of discussion happening in the world right now about this topic. And so even as you're talking about probiotics and the evidence is pointing toward that, there's not a consensus yet on even how to use probiotics. Is that, how do we get there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think actually Preemie Chats had a really good webinar June, sometime in the summer, maybe related to an event that happened where there was an adverse event related to probiotic exposure and necrotizing enterocolitis, and the FDA put a caution statement out. So I think listening to experts that you as a community present to us, that's part of the way that we can get there. The International Association for Prebiotics and Probiotics is the leading scientific organization with scientists and clinicians who are experts in probiotics. Please go to their website. They have a lot of great accessible information on prebiotics and probiotics. We also know that other types of libraries of evidence, including one called probioticchart.ca, so the clinical guideline for probiotics, there's an equivalent in the United States, help to essentially gather the evidence and rank the quality of evidence for commercially available probiotics and the specific indications they might be used for. So there are some really sound clinical and scientific groups and resources we can go to help with that. But it's a highly changing field. And so we just need to listen to the experts and be dynamic with the field as it comes.
Mm-hmm. I love this whole idea of the library of lived and living experience. It's like a light bulb went on for me of like, yes, like why hasn't this been done and caught on? And it's exciting to hear that there's a couple libraries up and coming. So how does this fit into, how does it integrate into the research? Do they partner with researchers? Is everything put out there as lived experience and considered, or how do you weed through almost the process of both research and lived experience? Because I think there's room for weeding of both.
That's right. I think this is really a co-design approach that we have to take and really learn from the people who are the experts by experience, the affected individuals, the families, the healthcare providers, and not just in the traditional, medical setting, for example. And that will help to inform research priorities, the development and the process in research studies, but also advocacy efforts. And it's just an ongoing process. These are new initiatives, these libraries. One of the strongest ones is a library that was established in the UK for adult-related health conditions, but it serves as a good example of what's possible. And of course, what goes into these libraries is only what the people who have the lived experience want to put into these libraries. And so that's why some of this in early research that we're doing to try to understand the landscape of what is already out there in terms of experience is really important, because that will help to shape what might go into future libraries. And then the question related to how do we actually integrate it into care decision making, this is really tough because we have this medical model that sees only one type of evidence, and we have other people who see their lived experience as being really valid evidence, and we need to bring these groups together to appreciate that both types of evidence are important, are valued, and actually do affect outcomes. We have so much data that show that the lived experience can improve care, can improve health outcomes, and we just need to do a better job of integrating that into our paradigm of care.
I think it's a total almost shift of the medical model and culture of there are lots of individualized experiences out there, but it sounds like you're bringing them together, and it can be similar in terms of, the strong evidence, weak evidence by the number of people
Absolutely.
who may have experienced the same thing.
Right. And I also look at it almost like personalized medicine. So, in the scientific and clinical fields, we talk about personalized medicine from the perspective of our genes, right? Maybe
Hmm.
we will be sequencing our genome and we'll understand how that can be used to personalize our treatment or response to treatments and care. Now, others are stepping back and saying personalization has to take into account environmental and social context. So, this is just another form of personalization, I think. And it's part of that holistic view that we need to take into account. It's not just about the biology. And I'm trained
Mhm.
as a molecular geneticist and nutritionist initially. So I understand that the biological mechanism is really important. But all of these other experiences work through biology to give us that eventual outcome. And so we have to consider them all.
And so when we look at the voices that are being integrated into the lived experiences, how will this, do you think, impact marginalized communities or those who maybe traditionally haven't had that quality care and the access to that care?
That's right. I mean, the first step is actually making sure that their voices are in libraries like this. So, right now, a lot of the information that's out there are from people who are willing to participate in these conversations, these stakeholder community engagement groups, and they tend not to be very diverse and representative. So, we need to work to actually go out and make sure these voices are included. And then the steps, will follow from that.
And what does that look like? Because I think that's the big question of
Yeah.
I think we want to include diverse voices, but you're right. We usually have a same kind of people group putting their hand up to bring their stories forward. So what is the process? How do those voices become a part of these libraries?
Well, I'll put my researcher hat on and I'll
Yeah.
say I think part of the responsibility lies in our funding agencies. So we
Mhm.
traditionally get funding to do research that is really focused on the research question and executing that research. There's less funding about bringing people in, even though in Canada we're doing a really good job about saying we need to incorporate other voices and the patient or the family or the expert perspective from the design process right through to the execution, analysis, and interpretation of our results. But we need money to do that because you cannot expect anyone to come to the table and give you their time and their expertise for free. And so I think we need to ask funders to make sure there are mechanisms that we can write into our grants or perhaps even additional pots of money that we can apply for that will allow us to engage all groups, but particularly equity deserving groups in a way that actually incentivizes them to be a part of this process.
Mhm. I wanted to talk about you had this. I thought it was a beautiful slide, actually, but it was the vaginal microbiome, and you were talking about the microbiome of preterm, maternal preterm versus full term.
Mhm.
And was I correct in interpreting that you're saying that there might be an ability to predict preterm based on that kind of research?
Yeah, that's right. So, similar to how you could get some blood drawn and look at various biochemical markers in the blood, the idea with some of this research is if you could take a sample of the vaginal microbiome, and if we know that there are certain microbial markers or metabolites that predict outcomes, in this case, preterm birth, you could potentially then get that sample long before preterm might occur and
Wow.
then see those women who might be at higher risk. And of course, there are many factors that would actually determine whether that individual goes on to deliver preterm, but it might then allow for earlier or more intensive monitoring in a way to help mitigate some of the adverse outcomes or severity of some of these conditions much sooner than would have been happening normally. And then, as I said, some of the ideas, if we can take that information, because usually one piece of information in isolation is not enough to have, a comprehensive picture. But if we could take some of that information in conjunction with other clinical data, other data we know that might place an individual at higher risk for developing preterm or having a low birth weight baby, that might give us a really robust picture earlier than we would have currently.
It's amazing. And when you
It's
think
fascinating.
oh, it is. And when I was reading the intro and I saw like the smallest of factors, it truly is like these tiny little things that have a major impact on people's lives. And so even thinking of, we talk about when babies are delivered vaginally, then there is a transfer of microbes. And so because it's different, I'm assuming there would also be an impact then on the preterm baby and what they're getting if they're birthed vaginally versus the term baby.
Yeah, that's right. So babies who are born vaginally, they are seeded by the microbes from the vaginal canal, also from the rectum through the birthing process. Whereas babies who are born by C-section, their initial microbial colonizers in the gut are those that are more reflective of the skin microbiome of the mother. Now, there's some data that starts to follow these babies out, and there's some normalization of that process. But you can also consider how the environment of that baby who's born vaginally versus by C-section might be different. Maybe the C-section baby is going into the NICU. So it's a very different type of industrial environment, if you will, different types of microbes around. Maybe there's antibiotic exposure and so on. So all of these things need to be considered. But we do know that, yes, there are some differences based on those early colonizers and exposures.
And it's a difficult thing to research because, as you said during a number of your slides, that you can start making threads and connections, but there's a number of factors that go into any one of those things. And so what is the future? What should people be expecting? As you said, it's a relatively new field even right now, and it feels like it's grown in leaps and bounds. And so what do you expect the future to look like?
Yeah, well, I would like to see more research in this area, particularly involving populations that aren't well represented. In the microbiome world, that's very true. Many of the populations that we've studied so far happen to be from weird countries, the Western, industrialized, educated, rich, democratic. So not a lot of racialized individuals, not a lot of populations from the global South. And in the context of the tiniest babies that we're talking about now, this is a small population, and it's very difficult to get sample sizes large enough to have really, really robust conclusions like we might in the adult nutrition or adult microbiome space. So if people are approached to be involved in a study and you feel comfortable doing that, I would say please do so, because you are helping move the science forward. But it really takes a community and of effort to do this work. And what to expect? That's a great question. I don't know, because the field is changing so quickly. But I do think that there are some really exciting studies that come out, on a weekly, monthly basis. And so just watching the science is going to be the best way to see where things are shifting and heading.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom. And I think, it was the perfect way, as I said in the intro, to finish off our November, our World Prem Month, because it really is advancing the care that will impact the global scale, especially as more voices get integrated into this kind of research. So thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to speak with you. Take care, Leah.
And thank you for joining us online for today's episode of Preemie Chats. A special thank you to AstraZeneca for their ongoing support of educational programs such as this one. And just a reminder that if you missed part of today's episode, or if you want to rewatch it, please head over to CanadianPreemies.org, and there you'll find this Preemie Chat, along with our full library, over 300 episodes covering many topics. You'll also find lots of free resources and support options available. And you'll be reminded that CPBF is a charitable organization, and it depends on support to continue its important work. I'd invite you to think about how you can support CPBF in their mission to empower families of premature babies in every step of their journey. And I do know that until December 31st, we have a toque campaign happening that if you donate $75 or more, then you'll receive one of these snazzy CPBF toques to keep you warm this winter. And it's important to note that even a donation of $50 is enough to offer free peer support to a preemie family. And so every bit counts. So just consider, especially as we come into the holiday season for many, what that might mean for you. I hope that you can join us here next Friday. We'll be back at 1 p.m. Eastern time, and we're going to discuss prematurity and the eye. All you need to know. So don't miss it. Together, we can create a brighter future for all preemies and their families. I hope you have a great weekend, everyone.